All right, so I'd like to talk about depression today, and it's something that I'm very familiar with, and I'd like to offer a different perspective on how you can perceive depression and perceive emotions in general. And I think it's important to consider that there's other ways to interpret the way we feel, other than what we are conditioned and programmed in society to interpret and understand our emotions. So I have a great deal of experience. I have a great deal of experience with depression. I was grown up in a traumatic, emotionally abusive environment, which led to depression for most of my life. As a child, I was deeply depressed, but kind of coped with that by overachieving and putting other people down, being really mean to other kids. That's how I kind of maintained and coped, and it was a form of release for my anxiety and my depression. And then, once I discovered smoking weed and drugs, really that was my main drug of choice. I was able to escape my depression and anxiety through smoking weed and just burying it down and altering my consciousness, and then just choosing to ignore it, turn away from it. And that obviously doesn't make it go away, so it continued on. So that was like teenage years, early adult years, and then moving into, I just discovered alcohol and started drinking. So it was a combination of drinking a ton and smoking weed constantly, and still depressed. But I had this knack for being able to put on like a real good front of everything's really great, and I was really good at acting. And I remember I used to go out a lot to bars, and people would always ask, like friends of mine, like, oh, like Dan must be like on tons of uppers and drugs because he's always so, happy and motivated and like in a good mood. And yeah, you know, on the outside, that's how I made it look. But on the inside, I'm deeply depressed. And, this was many, many years. And it wasn't until I changed a few things and got a different kind of perspective. And that's what I want to share with you, of how now I have this different perspective of how I perceive these kind of destructive emotions. And it's interesting because where we're at now with all of, psychology and science and the behavioral sciences and these doctors and all these experts that are running society, it's worse, in my opinion, and it's only getting worse. So the traditional approach of, okay, I'm depressed, so I go to a doctor, and the doctor says, well, you should take medication, or you should change something about yourself, or whatever. It all amounts to, we're judging the feeling as being negative and bad, and then we're choosing to just treat the symptom, which is the feeling is a symptom. We just treat the symptom, and really we turn away from it. We want to ignore it. We aren't taught that emotions mean something beyond, and if it's a negative emotion, we're taught to ignore it and turn away from it. And that has only got us so far in society, and now, like I said, it's only getting worse, and people aren't able to understand emotion. They're not able to process emotion, and they're not able to interpret emotion. And for me, what changed everything was doing the opposite. So, if we kind of use that as a rule of thumb of like, okay, the psychologists and behavioral scientists and therapists are telling us to, turn away from the emotion and let's just medicate and ignore it and just go off in space and just always be happy for the rest of our lives. Let's do the opposite of that, because that doesn't work. I mean, Everyone knows that. And I think it's a good rule of thumb in general with this kind of deranged system that we're living in is let's just do the opposite. And that probably will work. And so that's what I did. So, I reached a real low point. And I remember, I never pursued therapy or any kind of like doctors or medications or anything like that. I've always not been into any of that. I do not trust the medical industry. And I got to the point where I was just like, man, I've got to figure this thing out. And so what I chose to do was, rather than I spent an entire lifetime turning away from my depression, my anxiety, these destructive feelings and forces within me, I decided to face that. I turned right around and I looked directly at it. And, I wanted to understand it. I didn't want to judge it. I want to be objective in a sense, but I really want the truth. Why is this happening? What does this mean? What is the root of this? What is the truth? And I think what we need to really consider is we are everyday people solving everyday problems. We've left so much in the hands of these perceived experts who want to run society, and that's the society that is being built up around us, is a society run by experts. And we leave so much in the hands of people that we don't know. And then they're going to dictate like what's best for me. Like, this person doesn't know me. Yeah, they can do some psychological eval on me and say that, I have socially awkward tendencies or whatever their stupid definition is. But at the end of the day, they just want to productize my misery. And I want something different. So I'm an everyday person, and so are you. And it's time for us to empower ourselves and start solving everyday problems for ourselves, and then sharing that with one another, because we can do it. We don't need these other people. And so what's interesting about when you face an emotion and you want to understand it and observe it, if you kind of step back objectively from, let's just say, depression, a really destructive emotion. Now, depression, the way it affects you mentally and physically, it takes a lot of energy. It consumes a lot of energy. So it's very energy intensive. So you could say there's a lot of energy behind that destructive force. And if you consider changing from a destructive force to something that we can build with, because behind that destruction is a balance of the opposite, is of something that builds, and that is ever present in the world. That's common in everything. There's always something that's balancing. And so the trick is to face that and find the truth of it and begin to understand that. And through that understanding, we can use this reservoir of energy that is feeding this destructive force in our life, and then we can begin to shift that into something that's positive and can build through finding the truth. And so with a lot of these destructive feelings like depression and anxiety, when I started to lean into them and face them and try to learn from them, I interpreted them as warning signs. I was interpreting, okay, like, I'm super depressed, I'm super anxious, and that's my psyche, my body, my mind, my spirit. It's telling me something's not right. And I've been running from that my whole life. And being able to interpret that as actually something positive. Like, why can't you interpret depression as being something good? What if that's a warning sign and it's your inner self telling you, we got to get out of this situation. The lights are flashing, like it's time, and it's generating a lot of energy and momentum around it. So, and that's shifting the perspective of of how we understand and interpret emotions, because people, they don't, in the Western culture, the Western society, emotion is frowned upon. And I definitely remember growing up of like, oh, you're so emotional, you're just so emotional. And I'm, after kind of going through this and learning from my emotions and really connecting to my inner self, my true self, through my emotions, I'm convinced now that emotions are, they're like a key, and you can use emotions as a key to unlock a door, and you can unlock this door to your true self, and you can open up this vast expansiveness of like knowledge and energy and inspiration and more emotions. And in a sense, these negative emotions that we experience, like depression, anxiety, guilt, fear, they're, if we choose to face them, they end up pushing us towards our true selves. And because they force you to look within, and like you have to look at yourself, because there's no one else, because you're constantly looking outside of yourself for the answer of why am I depressed. So I don't know, I must look outside of myself. I must ask this perceived expert to tell me why. And yeah, they'll give you an answer, but obviously we know it's not right and it doesn't work. So I think the power of emotion is underrated. And I think the fact that we are emotional beings by nature, and we use emotion, and we feel emotion whether we are conscious of it or not. And it's important to be observant of your emotions, and if you can, be objective and try to separate, if you can, and observe the emotion. But ultimately, the emotion is going to lead you to the root of your problem, because your psyche, your mind, your body, your spirit is telling you there's a deep problem that's affecting your health and your likelihood of survival. You could even bring it to just a survival mechanism. And, it's using these emotions that bubble up to warn you. And if you can take the warnings that your body is giving you and face them and begin to get to the truth of them, you'll get to the root of the problem. And that's the trick. And that's what I was able to do, was look at the problem and start getting to the truth of it. And then, I just went down the list of all my problems, the laundry list of like all the crap that I had to, that was this kind of source of depression and anxiety and guilt and fear for me. And, as I went further down that list, it got easier and easier, which eventually led me to the root of my problem, which was, narcissistic abuse from a parent, which was, and I had no idea that was even a thing. But, through that warning sign of my depression, my fear, my anxiety, facing it, finding the truth, understanding it, it led me to that point. So now I have this different perspective about emotion. And it isn't to say like, oh, I don't experience depression or fear or guilt or anxiety, but it's different. It isn't so debilitating, and it isn't so strange. I see it as something beneficial. Like it's telling me and it's guiding me. And I actually have very little of that. I've taken great steps to alleviate the roots of my fear and my guilt, my anxiety and my depression. And once you start doing this, you get better at it. So then what we end up becoming and developing are these skills. We're everyday people solving everyday problems, and we now are building this discipline and this practice of solving these skills, or using skills to solve our problems. And the more you do it, the better you get. And that's where I'm at now, is I'm able to communicate it, and I can see it and understand it, and I can attempt to articulate it and communicate it to you, because it is an esoteric topic of like, oh, emotion is a key that unlocks a door to this vast expansive universe of knowledge. Like, if you tell someone that, they're going to think you're crazy. But for me, and the experience I'm having with you, is pure emotion. That's all it is. I mean, I'm just here sitting down talking, and it's all emotion, and I'm using emotion as inspiration to like bring a message through and across. And so there's no like reader board with words, and I'm like, okay, I have to say bring the message through and then pause. No, it's none of that. It's like I'm using emotion to be able to unlock this like energy so I can communicate this. And it's really interesting because you think like, oh, I got to be in this like right space and to make everything perfect, and I'm making this video, and it's got to be like, I got to say all the right things, and everything has to be so perfect, and it's really not, man. Like, if you can use emotion to communicate with, and then you can convey emotion, then that unlocks people. And that's that idea of emotion being this key, because even sharing emotion between people unlocks each other, and then you can connect even more. So I think it's worth considering there's other ways to interpret our depression, our anxiety, our fear, our guilt, these destructive emotions that we're experiencing. And it takes you doing it. Participation is mandatory, because otherwise you're leaving your own well-being in the hands of somebody that you really don't know. And I've talked about this before, but it's my opinion that a lot of the professional people that go into these fields of the behavioral scientists, the therapists, the psychologists, they're all extremely biased. At the end of the day, they're doing that as a business to make money. And I think a lot of good people go into those fields because they've experienced a lot of heavy trauma in their lives, and they're trying to interpret that trauma. And if you're ultimately going to one thing to interpret emotion and feelings and experiences, trauma, all these things, it's going to leave you empty. I think it's okay to categorize and organize and give titles and names and stuff like that, because we are brought up in the Western education system, and we need things in a linear fashion. That's how we learn. So that makes sense. But there's a lot more to this world than just textbooks and linear thinking and A plus B equals C, and the fastest way between 2 points is a straight line. Like, there's a lot more to this than that. And it's important to consider both. And that's really what my intention with what I'm working on here, is to be able to combine, that linear systems kind of approach with an intuitive, non-linear approach, so we can combine the best of both worlds, and we can use that, and that will be the tool that we're using, and the skills that we're developing using both modes of thinking, your left brain and your right brain. But yeah, I really feel like emotion is underrated, man. It really is. And the fact that society teaches us and tells us to ignore your emotions and escape them and run from them is a clear sign, because what's seeming like in society is society wants to oppress us. Society wants to keep us sick, unhealthy, and keep us in this oppressed state. So I think it's pretty easy. You just do the opposite of what society says. So anyway, that's my plan, and it's been working. So yeah, I encourage you to consider it. Anyway, I hope this was helpful, and I appreciate your time.